First of all, I want to ask you, do you think we will see gender equality in our lifetime?
We'd better do that. We have to make sure, not only in our lifetime, we have to do it now, yesterday, and it has to be, in any case, latest by 2030. That's the expiry date for gender discrimination, for inequality, for violence against women, and that's something that must not be shifted anymore.
In terms of looking back in this last 40 years, has there been significant progress in your opinion?
Absolutely. There has been progress in so many different areas. You have more constitutions around the world, more laws and policies and measures around the world that recognize and institute gender equality and women's empowerment. And there has been implementation of those laws in many countries of Europe and in US and the Western world, if you will. Women are now celebrating, as France has declared in its report, the third generation of women's rights achievement. But in many other countries of the world, and for most of humanity and womanity, if one may say that, there is still a long, long way to go, as we have recognized in this conference, whether it is in the area of education, whether it is in the area of how women are the majority of the world's poor and the extreme poor, how women are still in vulnerable employment, still paid less than men, how they continue to be discriminated in terms of promotion, and how women are underrepresented in places of power and decision making, whether in the political arena and governance or in the economic arena. So when you look at the media, when you look at all the other major influencers and determinants of society, women are indeed still lagging behind and not getting their due.
Now, you just mentioned inside the conference there the issue about cultural relativism. How important is that?
It continues to be important and stubborn, despite Beijing having ruled that you cannot invoke culture, tradition, or religion to violate women's rights or to discriminate or to engage in violence against women. Across the world, culture and religion and tradition give rise to harmful practices that impair women's enjoyment of human rights. And that's one aspect that also then entrenches discriminatory social norms and gender stereotypes.
There does appear to be some sort of rollback too, doesn't there? For instance, if you look in certain parts of the world, say for instance Egypt, there seems to be an issue there where one had hoped with the Arab Spring that women's rights would be higher up on the priority. But if anything, it's sort of slipped back, hasn't it?
This is part of the political contestation and cultural challenges that gender equality and women's empowerment faces. On one hand, we've never had the kind of focus on gender equality and women's empowerment and the priority and recognition that it is one of the key enablers and beneficiaries of sustainable development, of peace and security, of humanitarian action, of human rights itself, and democracy. And at the same time, we see some of the promises that we had hoped for to be realized in the context of, say, political democracy being realized. We are not seeing that happening, and in fact, in some cases, regression taking place. So yes, these are the most As I always say, these are some of the best of times for gender equality and women's empowerment, and big opportunities, particularly with the post-2015 development agenda, Beijing +20 coming together, climate change agreement next year. So a whole host of intergovernmental agreements, global agreements, reinforcing the normative imperative of gender equality and women's empowerment, holding governments accountable to it, and yet it is one of the most testing of times, including from extremist violence, and fundamentalism that we see, that is also challenging gender equality and women's empowerment.
Do you think the change will also come not just through legislation, but also a generational change as such, with younger men growing up and seeing women in power, seeing their mothers working? I mean, the reality is, at the end of the day, women like myself have much less in common with my mother than the men do of my age they have with their fathers. Is that something that will also assist gender equality?
Yes. I think the transformation has to be both top-down and bottom-up. And by that I mean that political will has to be really exerted to change institutions. Today somebody was talking about institutional inequality and discrimination and violence. And so we need to change institutions and make them gender responsive and gender inclusive. Women have to be in power and decision making. So that is something that must be done through laws and quotas and special measures. On the other hand, you also need to drive, and this is what our real, value added will be as UN Women as well, that through advocacy campaigns, through the mobilization of civil society and partnership with civil society around the world, both of men and women, and older people, but also younger people and youth, that we ignite a global solidarity movement for gender equality and women's empowerment. Unless we do that, we are not going to crack this issue and this resistance to change, because change and transformation is what we need to, in the mindsets, in the way people approach this, both women, in terms of the confidence they must assume and they must really drive, and at the same time, the understanding and responsibility that men, and young men included, must take on to stand up for gender equality and women's empowerment.
Lakshmi Puri, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.